There is an image in your head. You did not choose it. You did not build it from evidence. You did not arrive at it through research. You did not inherit it from anyone who ever laid eyes on the man it supposedly depicts. It was placed there, deliberately, systematically, over the course of 16 centuries. And the people who placed it there made absolutely certain that the images which contradicted it, the older ones, the ones with actual roots in history, were destroyed so completely that we spent 1,000 years not even knowing they had existed. There is a document that describes what Jesus actually looked like. Not a painting, not a mosaic, not a medieval artist's interpretation of a theological ideal, a written description, in a text that predates every image you have ever seen. That document was classified as forbidden, not because it was theologically dangerous, because of how specific it was. Specific in a way that threatened something far more valuable to the institutional church than any gospel. It threatened the image itself. And the image, as we are going to show you tonight, is not a portrait. It is a political weapon. One that has been pointed, without interruption, at every human being born into the Christian world for 1,700 years. That answer is coming. But first, you need to understand what was replaced, and who replaced it, and why replacing it required the most sustained act of visual propaganda in the history of human civilization. The face. Close your eyes for a moment. Picture him. Long hair, parted at the center, brown or auburn depending on which painting you are remembering, a beard, full but neat, eyes that are, in the medieval paintings, a surprising blue, tall, slender, a face that is calm in a way that seems almost architectural, a face that belongs inside a cathedral. You have just described a man invented in the 4th century AD, not by an artist, not by a visionary, by a Roman emperor who needed a god that looked like a god. Here is the fact that should stop you cold. The 4 canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, contain a combined total of 0 physical descriptions of Jesus Christ. Not one line. His height, not recorded. His hair, not recorded. His eyes, his build, his face, not a single word across 4 books that together run to tens of thousands of words about him. The men who walked with him, ate with him, watched him die, not one of them wrote down what he looked like. For 300 years after his death, Christian art reflected that silence. Go to Rome. Go into the catacombs beneath the city, the tunnels where early Christians buried their dead and scratched their faith into stone walls. Look at what they drew. A young man, clean-shaven, short hair, Roman tunic, carrying a lamb on his shoulders. No long hair, no beard, no halo. No pantocrator staring down from a golden dome. Just a shepherd. Borrowed, almost directly, from the Greek figure of Hermes, the ram-bearer, the guide of souls. The early Christians were not naive about this. They were operating inside a Roman world. They used Roman images because Roman images were the language their neighbors already spoke. And then, in the 4th century, a single man changed everything. The emperor. His name was Constantine. And before you think you know this story, stop. Because Constantine's conversion to Christianity is one of the most misunderstood events in the history of Western civilization. Constantine was not a theologian. He was a general, a political strategist. A man who had fought his way to sole rule of the Roman Empire through a series of civil wars that had left the empire exhausted, fractured, and desperate for cohesion. He understood, with the clarity of someone whose survival had always depended on reading power correctly, that a unified religion was useful, and that a fractured, persecuted, theologically diverse religious movement was not. So he ended the persecution of Christians. He called the Council of Nicaea. He helped consolidate the canon, and he changed the face of God. Because Constantine did not arrive at Christianity empty-handed. Before his conversion, and in the view of several serious historians, while maintaining that conversion with careful strategic ambiguity, Constantine was a devotee of Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun, a solar deity, popular among the Roman legions, depicted always as radiant, luminous, long-haired, divine. Now look at the first post-Constantinian images of Christ. Watch what happens to the face. The clean-shaven shepherd disappears. The long hair appears. The halo appears, borrowed directly from solar iconography. The disk of the sun translated into gold leaf behind a human head. And over the course of the next century, slowly, in mosaics and frescoes and carved ivory panels across the Roman Empire, the face migrates, from the shepherd to the sovereign, from the ordinary man to the Pantocrator, Christ the ruler of all, staring down from the apex of every dome in the Eastern Roman Empire. It takes approximately 100 years. By the time Justinian finishes building Hagia Sophia in the 6th century, the face is fixed, and the documents that described something different, something older, something that predated Constantine by 2 centuries, were already ash. The Forgery. Somewhere in the early medieval period, scholars debate the exact date, placing it anywhere between the 8th and 13th century, a letter begins to circulate through the churches of Western Europe. It presents itself as an official Roman document. A letter from a governor of Judea named Publius Lentulus, writing to the Roman Senate, describing a remarkable man he has encountered in his province. The letter says this: "There has appeared in our times a man of great power named Jesus Christ. His hair is the color of ripe chestnut, parted from the top of his head in the manner of the Nazarenes. His forehead is wide and serene. His beard is of the same color as his hair, full but not very long." It continues for several paragraphs. This letter was reproduced across medieval Europe, translated, cited, read from pulpits, quoted by theologians, used as a primary source by painters who needed to know, who were required to know before they put brush to panel, what the face of God looked like. The chestnut hair, the parted center, the full beard, the serene forehead, the image you have in your head. It came from this letter. And this letter is a forgery. There is no Roman governor named Publius Lentulus in any historical record, not in Josephus, not in Tacitus, not in any surviving administrative document of the Roman Empire. The name appears nowhere. The Latin is medieval, not classical. The document appears in no source before the early medieval period. Every serious historian who has examined it has reached the same conclusion. It was written, centuries after the events it describes, by someone who needed to provide a written source for a visual tradition that had no written source. A cover story, a document manufactured to explain an image that already existed. Now, ask the obvious question. If the Letter of Lentulus was created to provide a written source for the visual tradition, what was it created to replace? What earlier descriptions had existed? What had those descriptions said that required replacing with something more controllable? The answer is in the documents that were buried. What the buried texts said. The Nag Hammadi Library, 46 documents. Clay jar, Egyptian desert, 1945. If you have not watched the first video in this series, the one about the Gospel of Thomas, the short version is this. In 367 AD, a bishop named Athanasius of Alexandria ordered every non-canonical text in Egypt destroyed. Monks at a nearby monastery buried their library rather than burn it. That library sat in the desert for 1,600 years until an Egyptian farmer broke open the jar by accident. One of those 46 documents is called the Coptic Apocalypse of Peter. Not the Book of Revelation, not a vision of horsemen and trumpets, something far more specific, far more dangerous. It is a text in which Peter, the disciple, the man Jesus calls the rock upon which his church will be built, has a vision. During the crucifixion itself, and in that vision, he sees something he cannot explain. He sees two figures. He says to Jesus, "What do I see, O Lord? Is it you yourself whom they take? And who is this one, glad and laughing on the tree?" The Savior said to me, "He whom you saw on the tree, glad and laughing, this is the living Jesus. But this one into whose hands and feet they drive the nails is his fleshly part, the substitute being put to shame, the one who came into being in his likeness." Stop. Read those words again. The Jesus who is laughing, who is glad, is described as the living Jesus. The one being crucified is described as the substitute, a likeness, a fleshly stand-in. This is not a footnote. This is not an obscure theological variation buried in a technical document. This text describes the crucifixion, the absolute foundation of orthodox Christian theology, as something that did not happen the way the canonical Gospels describe it. It describes Jesus as standing apart from his own death, watching it, laughing. Not because he is cruel, because he cannot die, because what is being destroyed on that cross is a likeness, and he is beyond likeness. Think about what this does to the architecture of Orthodox Christianity. The entire theology of salvation is built on one transaction. Jesus suffers. Jesus dies. The debt is paid. The price is met. The sacrifice is made. Remove the suffering, remove the reality of the death, and the transaction dissolves. There is no price paid. There is no debt cancelled. There is no sacrifice. The bishops who assembled the canon understood this with absolute clarity. This was not a text they could ignore. This was a text that, if accepted as scripture, alongside Matthew and Mark and Luke and John, made Matthew and Mark and Luke and John wrong. It had to go. And so it went. The description they couldn't allow. But the Apocalypse of Peter is not the only suppressed text that touches on the physical reality of Jesus. There is a tradition, running through multiple early Christian documents, several of them excluded from the canon, that no church will teach, that no seminary will assign, that has been buried under 17 centuries of the Constantinian image. It is the tradition of the ordinary Jesus. There is a verse in the book of Isaiah, the 53rd chapter, the 2nd verse, that early Christians read as a prophecy of the Messiah. You have heard the famous lines from that chapter. A man of sorrows, acquainted with grief. But there is a line immediately before those famous words that is almost never quoted in a church. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. No beauty, no form that would make him remarkable, an ordinary face. And here is what makes this extraordinary. The men who quoted this verse as a description of Jesus were not Gnostic heretics. They were not fringe voices from a suppressed tradition. They were church fathers. Justin Martyr, Clement of Alexandria. Origen, foundational figures of early Christian theology, writing in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, explicitly arguing that Jesus was physically unremarkable, deliberately plain. A face you would not stop on the street of Jerusalem to look at twice. Origen, whose writings shaped Christian theology for centuries, was explicit. The beauty of Jesus was entirely spiritual. The physical man was undistinguished. Deliberately so. These men were not outliers. This was, for 2 centuries, simply what serious Christian theologians believed. And then Constantine needed a pantocrator, and the ordinary face disappeared. What science found? In 2001, forensic anthropologist Richard Neve of the University of Manchester led a team that did something no one had attempted before. They reconstructed a face, not Jesus specifically. Neve was careful about that. He never claimed otherwise. What they reconstructed was the statistically likely face of a 1st-century Galilean Jewish man, using 3 skulls found in the region, dating to the correct period, applying forensic reconstruction techniques used in criminal investigations. The result was published, circulated, discussed. And it caused a very specific kind of discomfort. The face was broad, dark, short hair, probably curly, consistent with regional practice of the period, a full beard, features that were entirely unremarkable in 1st-century Judea. Not European, not luminous, not the pantocrator. A face that would be completely invisible in a Jerusalem marketplace. This is not a portrait of Jesus. Neve never said it was. It is what the evidence points to, and it looks nothing like the image that was placed in your head. The image that required a forgery to defend it. The image that required 1,600 years of destroyed documents to protect it. The image that was placed there, deliberately, systematically, because the alternative was a Jesus that no empire could use. A plain man, in wood and stone, already everywhere you are, impossible to paint, impossible to sell, impossible to control. Why this matters. We are not going to tell you what to believe. That would be its own kind of irony, dictating conclusions about a tradition whose central argument is that conclusions must be reached alone. But we will give you the 2 positions, as we always do. Position 1. The image of Jesus that has dominated Western civilization for 1,700 years is not a historical portrait. It is a political construction. It was built by a Roman emperor who needed a god that looked like his previous god. It was defended by a medieval forger who manufactured an eyewitness account that no eyewitness wrote. And it was protected by the systematic destruction of every document that described something different. What was lost was not just a face. What was lost was an entire tradition, 2 centuries old, in which Jesus could not be imaged, could not be institutionalized, could not be sold. A tradition in which he was laughing on the cross because death could not touch him. A tradition in which he was already in the wood and under the stone. Position 2. Sacred art was never documentary. The Byzantine artists who created the Pantocrator were not attempting a photograph. They were expressing a theological truth in visual form. The face in the mosaic is a symbol. Christ as cosmic sovereign, as the principle underlying all things, and calling it a lie misunderstands what sacred art has always been. Both positions contain truth, but the problem is not the art. The problem is the forgery. The problem is the burned documents. The problem is that when the monks buried those 46 texts in the Egyptian desert rather than let them burn, they were preserving a tradition of Christianity that the Church had decided, for reasons that were political before they were theological, could not be allowed to survive. A tradition that said, "There is no image." A tradition that said, "He is already where you are." A tradition that said, "Look inside." Not up. Not at the mosaic. Not at the face someone else placed in your head. Inside. That is what was dangerous. Not a heresy. A direction. What comes next? 3 documents now. The Gospel of Thomas. The Gospel of Mary Magdalene. The Coptic Apocalypse of Peter. 3 different traditions. 3 different communities. 3 different ways of understanding who Jesus was and what he asked of the people who followed him. All of them buried in the same jar. All of them pointing in the same direction. And the most dangerous document in that jar has not been discussed yet. It was not a gospel. It was not a vision. It was a letter that described, with the precision of a technical manual, exactly what happens at the moment of death. Step by step. Specific enough that scholars who first read it did not argue about its theology. They argued about whether the person who wrote it could possibly have been guessing. Because the alternative, the thing no one wanted to say out loud in a university lecture hall, was that whoever wrote it had seen it. That document is in the next video. Everything in this series came from one clay jar in an Egyptian desert. But the most forbidden document wasn't a gospel. It was a letter describing the afterlife in mechanical detail, specific enough that it was forbidden the moment it was found. That video is next. Subscribe to Golden Dash, a new buried document every 2 days.